Good afternoon. At this afternoon's Intelligence Forum's Who Are You podcast, we're privileged to have John Redwood, who was a Member of Parliament for Wokingham in Berkshire from 1987 to 2024. Wow, that's 35 years. It's amazing. Secretary of State for Wales in the major government and served in the shadow cabinets of William Hague and Michael Howard. Was knighted in 2019, elevated to the House of Lords earlier this year, and is no stranger to business, finance and world markets. And this meeting today is principally about growth in the UK and how we might get a bit more of it. But the first question I'd like to ask, and thank you, John Redwood, for having this meeting today. First question I'd like to ask you is, when you entered Parliament in 1987, if I'm not mistaken, growth rates were in excess of 5%. What were the enablers of that? And should we be looking to have a dab of it now?
Yes, so Margaret Thatcher and her team turned the economy round. It was in a very bad shape at the end of the 1970s. Their counter-inflation policy, 79 to 81, continued the bad news. We had a nasty recession. Then after that, everything was in place for a very strong and positive recovery. And as you rightly say, we had very good growth rates for much of the 1980s. Keys to all that were, first of all, backing a good free enterprise private sector, allowing them to get on and raising capital and to do new things. Crucial was getting tax rates down. There was a big tax reform to lower corporation tax rates so that Britain was competitive again after very high labour taxes in the 70s, and a big reduction in personal tax rates, which transformed it. And what was so good about that was not only were people better off and many more highly paid jobs were created and many more highly paid jobs came to Britain, but the taxpayers were better off because it produced so much more revenue as well. I managed to write a draft for Margaret Thatcher halfway through this process when I was able to say that all the ne'er-do-well people were wrong when they said that if you cut the taxes on the rich, you would lose revenue and they just make a fortune. And I was able to say that since they took the highest rate of tax down from a stunning 83% to 40%, the rich were paying more tax in cash terms, they were paying more tax in real terms, and they were paying a bigger proportion of the total tax levied. And it just showed that jealousy, the 1970s Labour policy, didn't work. We'd exported too many talented people, we'd put off foreign investors, we'd put off people saving and investing their money well. And in the 1980s, we unleashed the spirits of enterprise and savers started committing their money to good ventures. And we, for example, saw the free enterprise system finance what was then the technological revolution. That was the mobile phones and the much better array of things you could add to phone lines so you could start to handle data as well as phone conversations. And that telecoms revolution was crucial to the 1980s growth rate, just as the AI revolution should be crucial to today's growth rate, but it's mainly happening in America and China.
I mean, how much of a hindrance to growth in recent days has the great financial crisis of 2007-8 and the pandemic? What roles have they played in a negative way, in your view?
Well, they were both very damaging. And the first was created by very bad government at the Treasury and by bad central banking, so that the United Kingdom allowed an inflation of assets to get out of control and didn't think it mattered. And then they clamped it far too severely rather late in the day and created an avoidable and very nasty deep recession. And then with the COVID experience, not as dramatically bad as the crash of 2008, which brought down much of the banking system. But the COVID experience repeated some of those errors. Again, it was bad central banking and treasury advice, so that the country spent and borrowed too much and printed too much money, that the predictable happened, and then they overplayed the correction yet again, so then the economy was slowed too much. So avoidable errors, ministers had to take the blame. In the case of the 2000s, it was definitely Gordon Brown that was responsible because he was driving it. He was very hands-on. In the case of Boris and Rishi Sunak, they accepted too much of the official advice and they should have overruled it in the way some of us were telling them to do.
Another curious question I have is that the Reeves and Starmer administration, the cost of employing people and for business, the increased cost to businesses, what effect has that had on growth and prosperity, in your view?
Well, it's been very negative because by the time Rishi Sunak prematurely went to the country, he had actually got the economy into good order and we had inflation back down to 2%, which is where it should have been. And we had fast growth rate for the first half of 2024. We were the fastest growing for the whole of the first half of 2024 of the G7. And some of that was going to be sustainable. And he had finished putting up taxes. He put them up a bit more than I would have liked, but they were still just about competitive. And then Reeves and Starmer arrive, and they do a double whammy. They first of all spend several months saying, we're not going to tell you what's in our budget yet. And they tried out all sorts of tax rises, which put people off saving and spending and investing and put people off coming to Britain. They then had a tax raising budget and said that it was one and done. And then they go through exactly the same debilitating exercise the next year when, oh, whoops, we didn't actually raise enough tax and we do want to spend more. And the Treasury are telling us that we can't just borrow more. And so they go through the same dreadful exercise with everybody worried about a whole series of tax rises in prospect. And then they still put some on. And as you rightly identify, I mean, the worst tax rises were the direct hits on the cost of employing people. And that has driven unemployment up under the Conservatives, 2010 to 2024. They halved unemployment. They brought it well down from the levels they inherited. And now we've seen it going up more or less every month since Labour took over because they're taxing us to death.
I mean, we're all waiting, of course, to find out who's going to be in the new Burnham cabinet. But if we go back over the last 2 years, one of the interesting things from my perspective, working with small businesses, is that very few, if any, had to worry in the cabinet about payroll or any of these things that businesses have to worry about because they've never worked in one. What's your observation on that?
Yes, I mean, I think these ministers are quite often lost. They think up a soundbite, which is often a very popular soundbite, that we're going to grow the fastest in the G7, or a popular soundbite that we're going to smash the gangs and stop all these illegal migrants, which are obviously adding quite a cost burden and causing housing difficulties. But then nothing happens because they haven't thought through how you do it. And they've either got civil service advice saying, well, that's a bit difficult to do, Minister, or they got civil service advice for a scheme that doesn't work. And I'm afraid the minister has to take the blame and has to go off and get some better advice. And they just don't know how to do these things. You know, let's take the well-intentioned policy of wanting to keep some steel capacity to make virgin steel from blast furnaces. And then they blunder in. And 15 months ago, they take responsibility for the finances and operations of a company they don't own, which happens to be owned by a Chinese company. They don't get any agreement with the Chinese company. Then they discover that it would be better if they owned the plant. And so then they put through legislation to say we're going to nationalize it. They've now nationalized it, so they've taken possession of it. They still haven't compensated or squared the Chinese. And so now the Chinese are telling the world that you don't want to invest in Britain because they might simply take your assets. And if they'd been businesslike, they would have gone to those Chinese owners when the problem first arose and reached a deal with them. And the deal should not have included lots of compensation because the thing was bankrupt and it was losing a colossal amount of money. And the state was going to accept responsibility for the employees who otherwise would have cost the company a fortune in redundancy bills. And so they should have been able to secure it in a sensible way, but they didn't have enough business-like experience to know that you need a tough negotiation while you still can. They're now in a very weak position and they're probably going to end up paying compensation to the Chinese, which I deeply regret, following legal threats.
The levelling up agenda, something that you will have witnessed several times in your period in Parliament, and this Burnham move to the north, what are your thoughts? How does that work? How do you make it work? I mean, I'm all for giving all parts of the country a fair deal, but do you worry that a lot is going to be taken away from the southeast?
Well, I think that is sort of misconception because you don't get prosperous by government schemes. You get prosperous by creating the conditions in which free enterprise can generate growth and new jobs and can show you how to seize the opportunities of new technology. And as I said, in the 80s, it was liberalizing and making the telecom system competitive. It was privatizing telecoms and then harnessing the British markets to raise huge amounts of capital for all the new wizardry that could be added onto phone lines and replacing a lot of the phone lines because they were old fashioned and too small. We've got to do the same now. And AI is the kind of technology that can create new success places anytime you like, as long as you've got the right background so that people think they can set up their own business and they can set it up from their bedroom. And their bedroom has got to have access to decent broadband. And we just need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, the tax rates are sensibly low, and that people are getting the advantage of proper training and the decent education. And then why not unleash the AI successes of Yorkshire or Lancashire and don't have them all concentrated in London? But you're not going to achieve that by sending another grant to Manchester. It will be for a scheme that a lot of people don't want and doesn't actually generate the businesses that create the prosperity and the jobs.
I've got one or two more questions, and the first one is energy costs. How do we deal with that?
Well, the energy costs are, of course, what is wrecking so much of the industrial economy of the United Kingdom. We have the highest advanced country energy costs of anywhere. And it's because of the self-harm and the self-defeating policies of net zero that have been intensified by Mr. Miliband. And the first thing you had to do is strip away the carbon taxes and the emission trading charges, which we inherited from Europe, where we might make them even worse by going back into the even dearer European scheme. You can't afford that. You need to have plentiful supply of cheap energy. Secondly, you need more domestic energy. We're importing far too much. And it is complete madness that this government won't get our own oil and gas out of the North Sea or look for any more gas onshore in the United Kingdom mainland, because there's plenty there and it needs to be harnessed. And any other country would harness its own energy first. And it's not merely self-harming that we don't get out this great resource, but it is self-defeating because it is done in the name of reducing CO2. But of course, it increases world CO2 because if we keep our gas in the ground and import liquefied natural gas, the government has told me it's 4 times as much CO2 to burn liquefied natural gas than it is to burn our own gas down a pipe because of all the energy it takes to compress it, liquefy it, cool it, transport it in a diesel-driven tanker, and then convert it back to gas again, which you don't need to do with your own gas. So we need to stop the self-harm and we need to get on with rebuilding our industry. Because we had very good oil and gas reserves and a good oil and gas industry, that was one of the successes which gave us more growth from 1980 through to about 2010. We had quite a reasonable petrochemical and chemical industry on the back of it since 2010. With some natural decline in the North Sea now being accelerated by these crazy policies. We're also losing the derived industries. So we've lost 2 of our 6 refineries under this government already, and they were colossally important assets. And we've lost quite a lot of our petrochemical activity as well. So we're just going to end up importing all of these industrial things, and we won't have that reindustrialization, which Mr. Burnham rightly wants, but will not achieve unless he reverses these very dangerous net zero policies.
What are your concerns? Final question, and I very much appreciate this interview. What are your concerns about the debt levels in the UK, the national debt?
Well, the national debt is far too high, and many have commented on that, but none seem willing or able to stop it so far. When George Osborne set up the OBR, everybody said, oh, this is going to be a very good discipline. And the main aim of the OBR was to stop the rise in debt. And each year they solemnly pointed out the debt was getting too high, and governments solemnly promised to do something about it in the future. But unfortunately, both the Osborne system and the Reeves system is useless at controlling the debt. And so over the period since 2010 with the OBR, the public debt has tripled. Now, how can people say this is providing a decent discipline to the British state when that happens? And it was so obvious it was going to happen, because the OBR was always talking about controlling the debt in year 5, whereas you start to control the debt by controlling it in year 1. And I've regularly each year taken to Conservative governments, and now make it publicly available to Labour governments, a series of things you could do immediately to take billions off the spending and therefore off the increase in debt. And they never do them because they are not interested in controlling the colossal waste of money going out from the British government.
One last question. So it may not be directly related to growth, but it's a concern of mine. So I sit on a train, I go to Leeds, I go to these various places, and I look at this beautiful agricultural land, especially on the East Coast line. I'm seeing increasingly more solar wind panels taking up prime agricultural land. What's your perspective on that? And I know that's not necessarily related to growth.
Oh, it is related to growth, because another industry, just like petrochemicals and oil and gas, that we are doing in by silly net zero policies is the case of agriculture. Now, the tragedy of agriculture began when we joined the European Economic Community for the first time in the early 1970s, because we had to sign up to the Common Agricultural Policy. And they designed a system which meant that we couldn't produce all our own milk. They rationed how much milk we were allowed to produce. They then, when we had an unpleasant disease in our cattle stock, for far too long, stopped us rebuilding and stopped us selling our meat products outside the United Kingdom. And that did enormous damage to our animal husbandry. And the subsidy regimes were always much more favorable to less efficient farms on the continent. So it did us a lot of damage, and we lost a big chunk of market share in temperate products. Even worse was they started offering EU grants to British fruit farms, for example, to grub up their orchards, to give priority to France and Spain, who were selling a competitive product. And now we've got the extra aggravation, which you've identified out of your train window, that we give huge subsidies to companies to take good agricultural land and put on it solar farms. And so a lot of landlords now say, why am I bothering to farm this land, or why am I bothering to have a tenant farmer who can't make a very good return? I can make far more money if I let probably a French utility take it on and sell solar generated energy on very favorable terms to the grid. And so that is an addition to the tragedy of British agriculture, as you rightly say, in the Fenlands, for example. We have fabulous soils. We've got a perfectly good climate, and we ought to be making more use of it for food growing.
I'm sure we could move this interview over several days. So there's so much to talk about, but I'm very much appreciative, John Redwood. Thank you very much indeed for this interview. Thank you.